Venezuela Turmoil, HG Infiltration and Earth Alliance Moves, Global Update 2025. Unseen forces, military maneuvers, and strategic pressure shape the Venezuelan crisis and regional stability. Welcome to the Geopolitics Update channel. Tuesday, December 9, 2025. Unusual military movements sweep across the Caribbean, coinciding with leaks indicating infiltrations by the hidden government, HG, a consistently hostile force, within strategic diplomatic structures. Pentagon reports highlight abrupt changes in U.S. naval mobility. The Earth Alliance monitors these warning signs. European intelligence and Asian sources confirm force repositioning near Venezuela and note unconventional patterns of aerial surveillance. Independent analysts observe that U.S. pressure on Caracas intensifies simultaneously with discreet negotiations involving Cuba and regional actors, while the Vatican, as an indirect observer, monitors the silent escalation to prevent potential humanitarian repercussions. Debate over American foreign policy in Latin America intensifies. U.S. officials reaffirm that defending the Western Hemisphere and its strategic interests remains a priority, despite external criticism. Kremlin sources, consulted regarding U.S. movements, indicate that Moscow assesses every Caribbean action as part of a broader strategy, aiming to understand ripple effects in the Atlantic and Eurasia. In Brazil, the 2026 electoral scenario begins to take shape. Flavio Bolsonaro emerges as a primary name in internal analyses, while centrist political sectors and the alliance discreetly monitor movements that could affect regional balance. Potential coalitions involving Tarcísio de Freitas and Michel Bolsonaro are evaluated as strategic alternatives. The situation in Venezuela remains critical. Pressure on Nicolas Maduro grows due to international isolation, economic decline, and Cuban influence over key military sectors. Independent military sources warn that any precipitate action could trigger humanitarian crises reminiscent of historically complex scenarios. The U.S. presence in the Caribbean is assessed as deterrent, aimed at isolating illicit networks and maintaining strategic control while avoiding direct confrontations that could destabilize the region. Anonymous reports indicate HG infiltrations into Venezuelan decision-making channels and efforts to manipulate information on internal negotiations. The alliance, in turn, acts to technically contain these interferences, monitoring critical points and anticipating strategic moves that could further destabilize the regional board. Pentagon sources reinforce that coordination with allies is decisive to exert pressure without unnecessary escalation. Intelligence alerts indicate that covert HG operations continue to influence key sectors in Caracas, while the alliance tracks strategic asset movements. Independent sources suggest HG agents attempt to manipulate internal military decisions, interfering with logistics and local commands. Simultaneously, Pentagon reports record abrupt changes in aerial interception patterns, reinforcing the perception that coordinated actions are being planned to keep Maduro in a controlled resistance posture. The U.S. military presence in the Caribbean remains robust. Carrier and ground troop deployments are closely monitored by Kremlin sources, who assess regional impacts and diplomatic repercussions in Eurasia. Tension rises as Washington maintains economic and diplomatic pressure, while Vatican observers discreetly monitor potential humanitarian and political consequences, emphasizing the need for calculated actions. Within the U.S., strategic debates involving Marco Rubio and foreign policy advisors reveal divergences over the pace of action against the Venezuelan regime. Independent military sources assess that coordination with regional allies is crucial to maximize impact without undesired escalation. The alliance monitors these movements, neutralizing HG interference, while forces of light operate discreetly in critical containment points. In Latin America, the alignment of countries such as Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, and the Dominican Republic with measures isolating the regime reinforces the diplomatic blockade. Leaked Russian reports suggest Moscow closely observes Washington's moves, evaluating hemispheric escalation risks. This hybrid pressure scenario combines diplomatic, military, and economic actions, all monitored continuously by the alliance and the forces of light. In Brazil, the electoral race remains under close observation. Flavio Bolsonaro and potential alliances with Tarcísio de Freitas and Michel Bolsonaro are monitored by the alliance as indicators of regional political balance. Internal sources indicate that maintaining electoral stability is strategic for Washington and regional allies to preserve influence without triggering direct conflicts, preventing the Latin American board from becoming unstable alongside the Venezuelan crisis. The Venezuelan regime faces increasing structural fragility. Pentagon-affiliated military sources indicate inconsistencies in Maduro's control over strategic armed forces units, while the alliance monitors HG infiltrations aimed at sabotaging communications and logistics. Independent reports highlight that intermediate officers may refuse orders deemed compromising, creating risks of internal miscoordination. Concurrently, Kremlin sources assess that U.S. pressure, combined with the loss of regional support, creates instability exploitable by external actors, including Cuba and strategic allies in Caracas. Vatican observers note the need for humanitarian attention, especially in civilian risk areas, suggesting that discreet negotiations could prevent critical escalations. U.S. operations in the Caribbean continue at variable intensity. Naval and air unit presence remains high, while internal reports indicate HG attempts to manipulate public perception of the regime's legitimacy. The alliance counters these sabotage efforts, deploying forces of light at strategic points to contain hostile operations and mitigate civilian risks. Geopolitically, the European Union remains divided over sanctions and pressure on Venezuela. Asian sources express concern about global economic and political repercussions, particularly in strategic supply chains affected by regional instability. Meanwhile, U.S. independent sources highlight that the convergence of internal and external factors strengthens the perception that gradual regime changes are inevitable, even without direct action. Within Brazilian politics, party movements remain discreetly influenced by external analyses. The alliance closely tracks decisions regarding candidacies and alliances, considering potential impacts on regional stability. Anonymous sources suggest Brazil's political balance directly affects Washington's ability to coordinate multilateral pressure in Latin America, making the next stage of the geopolitical board decisive for operations in Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro's regime shows signs of accelerated erosion. Pentagon and independent military sources indicate critical logistical failures, strategic resource shortages, and growing discontent within the armed forces. Simultaneously, the hidden government, HG, always hostile, intensifies information manipulation and institutional sabotage, while the alliance acts technically to monitor and neutralize infiltrations. Forces of light are discreetly mobilized at strategic points to protect vital infrastructure and mitigate sabotage risks. Kremlin reports assess that U.S. pressure and the regime's international isolation create opportunities for external actors, including Cuba. Asian sources highlight supply chain and energy market repercussions, warning of indirect hemispheric stability impacts. The Vatican maintains indirect communication with regional intermediaries, reinforcing the possibility of mediation in case of abrupt collapse without direct intervention. In the Caribbean, U.S. military presence remains high. Anonymous internal sources report unusual logistics and communication movements, interpreted as HG attempts to destabilize the pressure environment. The Earth Alliance, in its first official mention, maintains centralized oversight and containment coordination, ensuring rapid detection and neutralization of any infiltration. Simultaneously, diplomatic tension between Washington and the European Union persists. Independent sources indicate that digital and economic sanctions are used by the HG to manipulate narratives, while the alliance works to mitigate strategic impacts without escalating the confrontation. Coordination between military and diplomatic pressure is critical to maintain regional balance. In Brazil, the political scenario is closely monitored. Military and independent sources note that electoral decisions, candidacies, and alliances directly affect the ability to pressure Venezuela and influence HG positioning. The upcoming electoral period heightens risks, reinforcing the need for the alliance's continuous vigilance over hostile movements and transnational interference attempts. Escalation in the Caribbean region maintains maximum alert. Pentagon-affiliated military sources observe that naval and aerial patrol patterns deviate from usual protocols, suggesting preparations for targeted containment actions. Independent sources corroborate, noting anomalies in logistics routes potentially exploitable by the hidden government, HG, to undermine strategic efforts. The alliance continues monitoring, applying discreet countermeasures, and deploying forces of light at critical points to ensure operational integrity and minimize sabotage risks. Kremlin reports highlight concern over regional repercussions of U.S. military presence, emphasizing that any precipitate move could alter hemispheric balance. Asian sources project indirect impacts on global trade and energy supply chains, underscoring the need for multilateral coordination. Internally, the HG attempts to exploit diplomatic fissures among allies, but cross-analyses show limited effectiveness due to continuous alliance oversight. In Venezuela, armed groups aligned with Maduro's regime remain active. Independent military sources emphasize sabotage risks to infrastructure, while the alliance maintains control over strategic points, ensuring hostile actions are contained. Cuba's role as an external actor is closely monitored, and any HG attempt to reinforce or manipulate support is quickly detected and neutralized. The complexity of the scenario requires calibrated decisions. Anonymous internal sources indicate that unforeseen HG movements can be anticipated through communication and logistics pattern analysis. The alliance operates in coordination with indirect Vatican observers and other neutral entities to reinforce stability without direct escalation, keeping tension under control. The political and military board remains unstable. The dynamic between U.S. pressure, Venezuelan regime isolation, HG actions, and alliance response, combined with international surveillance, maintains high escalation risk. Every decision, action, or reaction will be critical for the region's next steps, requiring continuous attention, cross-analysis, and comprehensive strategic oversight. The Caribbean and Latin American landscape remains on high alert. The HG, now identified as a hostile force, continues infiltration, sabotage, and manipulation attempts, while the alliance monitors every move, applying technical measures and deploying forces of light when necessary to neutralize risks. Pentagon sources confirm unusual military mobility patterns, while independent sources highlight minor breaches exploitable by the HG, rapidly contained by the alliance. Kremlin sources reinforce the perception that any precipitous U.S. action could have hemispheric repercussions, while Asian observers analyze economic and strategic impacts on a global scale. The Vatican's role as an indirect observer adds a diplomatic layer to surveillance, legitimizing containment actions without direct military escalation. In Venezuela, pressure on Maduro's regime remains intense. Armed groups, parallel networks, and external support from Cuba continue to be monitored. The alliance ensures any HG attempt to manipulate local scenarios or reinforce the regime is detected and neutralized, maintaining control over strategic points and preserving operational integrity. The situation combines multiple elements: U.S. military pressure, international surveillance, HG infiltration, alliance strategic actions, and constant evaluation by global sources. Each move on the regional board has the potential to alter diplomatic and military scenarios, making constant attention and multi-dimensional analysis essential. The outcome of the Venezuelan crisis, the impacts of transatlantic tensions, and the next steps in American foreign policy and the alliance remain open. Continuous monitoring, technical coordination, and strategic reading of the shadows dictate the pace of the region and shape the scenarios that will unfold in the coming weeks and months. End of the report, folks. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join the conversation in the comments. If you'd like to support us directly, consider making a donation using the link in the description or the QR code on screen. Your contribution helps us work better, and keeps this project alive and independent. Thank you so much. And see you in the next report. This content is a narrative adaptation based on public themes of global geopolitics. The version presented has been transformed with a unique style, based on public information, analysis, and opinions, and is intended solely to inform and entertain.